years on from a political milestone in Egypt, a constitutional referendum which saw millions taking part in the first free and fair vote. A turning point for Egypt, but in which direction? Hello, I'm Jane Dutton and welcome to Inside Egypt, the first of our in-depth discussions looking at events as they unfold and what's behind the headlines. And a broad coalition of opposition groups has called for a new revolutionary wave to last until the end of the month. Protests have been taking place to mark the third anniversary of the March 2011 referendum on a post-revolution constitution. Thousands across the country have joined in. The National Alliance to Support Legitimacy is behind the campaign. The group is demanding what it's calling the return of constitutional legitimacy and a return to the ideals of the 2011 revolution, such as freedom and social justice. But the protests are nothing like the scale of past demonstrations, deterred by concerted government security. They're also taking part as the largest trial in Egypt's history gets underway. 1,200 supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi are facing charges stemming from violence in August. Among the accused is the Muslim Brotherhood's general guide, Mohammed Badai, the Muslim Brotherhood having been designated a terror group in December. A complex series of developments to understand. So let's get the thoughts of our guests on what all this means for Egypt. In Washington, D.C., Adel Iskandar, professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University and the author of Egypt in Flux. In our London studios is Karul Kirsten, a senior lecturer in the study of Islam and the Muslim world at King's College. And joining us from Minneapolis, we have Abdul Mahmoud Dadri, Foreign Affairs spokesman for the Freedom and Justice Party and a former member of the Egyptian Parliament. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start off with you, Abdul Dadri. 3 years on from that referendum, how would you describe your Egypt?
Thank you first for having me. I consider the 19th of March 2011 referendum is the beginning of the betrayal of the objectives of the Egyptian revolution. When Egyptians went to the streets on January 25th, they demanded four things: freedom, economic prosperity, social justice, and the human dignity. We believed in formal democracy. But what the army did, the army planned something else other than formal democracy. The army disbanded the parliament that I was a member of, that was elected by 32 million Egyptians. First time ever in the history of modern Egypt, we see free and fair election. When it failed to promote its own agenda, the military agenda, it tried to sabotage the Constitutional Committee. And again, it failed. And then it tried to cause judiciary coup against President Morsi, who was the first elected ever president of Egypt. And when it failed, it decided to move physically, kidnap the president, suspend the constitution, dismantle the Shura Council, kill thousands of Egyptians in the streets of Egypt and Rabaa and other places, and then putting more than 21,000 political prisoners in the jails of Egypt. For me, as an elected member of the Egyptian people, and I speak for the people of Egypt, this is not accepted at all. We will never recognize the coup. We will never accept it. We will resist it all the way until we bring democracy back, rule of law, human rights, and social justice. This is where I see it from where I stand.
Adel Iskandar, do you think he does speak on behalf of the Egyptian people, and do you think that's a fair analysis of what Egypt has become in the last 3 years?
Well, I'm in no position to speak for the Egyptian people either, and I think Mr. Dardiri should probably refrain from doing the same. So I cannot verify his ability to represent them, but I can sort of question the history that he's described. But I want to take us back to March 19th, 2011. I find myself surprised to agree with Mr. Dardiri that this was the beginning of the end of the revolution's commitments. But for history history's sake, one needs to acknowledge the fact that not only did the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization for which the party that Mr. Dardiri speaks on behalf of, supported wholeheartedly the drafting of this constitutional referendum and pushed it and used vitriolic language in some ways, very divisive language. I consider March 19th to be the beginning of the end of the revolution because of the fragmentation of a unified front that actually had both the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as an entire spectrum of political forces. This was an opportunity for the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces to really sow the seeds of dissidence and dissent between the different revolutionary currents. And the Muslim Brotherhood took the bait and ran with it. They were advocating the passing of the referendum on the grounds that any other alternative would mean the end of Article 2 of the Constitution, which meant that Egypt's sort of legislative framework came from Sharia, which really was not the main impetus behind the constitutional referendum. And to me, the following 3 years have been a continuation of the same policy. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood unfortunately appear to be the other side of the same coin. I mean, I agree with Mr. Dardiri that the military have brutalized the political process, but one needs to take responsibility where there is complicity. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, until the day when Morsi was removed, sang the praises of and cheerleaded the military to the abyss, essentially, to Egypt's abyss. So there needs to be a sort of a real openness and a real acknowledgement of failure at this point. I mean, it was Mr. Dardiri's party that came out and supported the referendum that he now thinks was deeply problematic. So I think there are different views and perspectives on history, but I think we would both agree that Egypt is not in a particularly good place right now.
Okay, let's bring in the view and perspective of Carol Kirsten. What do you make of the last 3 years as the power has shifted from one camp to the other?
Well, even with the benefit of hindsight, I would caution against jumping to conclusions and a sort of present conspiracy theories. I don't think there is hard evidence that in March 2011 the military had a ready-made, preconceived plan and a sort of orchestrating what has happened in the ensuing 3 years. Certainly they had, of course, their own vested interests built up over decades of being in power in Egypt. They had a vested interest in that and protecting their interests. But on the other hand, it is indeed true that the Muslim Brotherhood was in support of the amendments that were introduced in 2011. Very ironically, two of the most important changes at the time, curtailing of the government's possibilities of imposing unlimited states of emergency in the country, and also putting restraints on using terrorist charges to go for whole-scale repression, were at that point in time severely curtailed by the new regulations. It's very ironic that exactly these 2 points, a state of emergency and persecuting people on terrorism charges, are very high on the agenda. Another thing we have seen after these amendments is that since then we have had no less than 2 constitutions. So in even so many years we have seen 3 attempts to change the constitution of Egypt. That clearly reflects the political uncertainty and the instability of Egypt. And the main lesson we learned from that is how extremely fragile these transitions to democracy can be. And there is also lessons to be learned from other countries which have had an opportunity to pursue this for much longer. Indonesia had regime change in 1998, ran even 3 fair and free elections, but only this year, more than 15 years after the regime change, you see a first new face being a candidate for the presidency. It teaches you that the political elites tend to be extremely resilient and resourceful in protecting their interests.
It certainly seems to be the case. All 3 of you spoke about the Constitution, obviously very important, the backbone to the country. Egypt has revised its constitution 3 times since the 2011 revolution. And as we've mentioned, the landmark first vote took place 3 years ago this month, winning 77% approval. It was only ever meant to be an interim constitution and was criticized for giving the military full presidential powers. The second was hurriedly signed into law by Mohamed Morsi in December 2012. It was passed with 64% of the public vote, but was criticized as a, quote, Islamist's constitution. The latest in January gained 98% approval. Turnout was 38%, with criticism this time focused on a failure to protect civil rights and for granting more power to the presidency. So after 3 constitutional changes, is the problem that Egypt has failed to bring about a new social contract based on the revolutionary ideals of freedom and social justice? And I'm going to put that question to you, Abdul Dadri.
Yes, I think there is a failure from all political sides to come to a social contract. And the reason why I say I speak on behalf of the Egyptian people is because I was elected by the people of Egypt as a member of the parliament. The problem of March 19th, 2011 is that all political parties participated in the referendum. We, as well as other political parties, believed in formal democracy. The process that people went to the streets so that to bring the whole system down and create a new system based on economic prosperity, freedom, social justice, and human dignity. It is unfortunate. Now I can say, I don't believe in conspiracy theory, but what I'm saying now, I can easily say that the military was waiting for the moment to come and dismantle this new regime. There were 2 regimes contesting one another: the old regime, Mubarak's police state, and the new democratic regime. I don't think there is a comparison between the referendum, the constitution that was approved during Morsi's time, and the constitution that was approved during the coup. The coup does not provide democratic institutions. The coup comes to end democracy. That's why it failed even to protect its own jargon that it said that it came to continue the democratic process.
Okay, let me bring in Carol Kirsten. Yes, excuse me jumping in. Sorry, I mean, do you think the constitution has really served the military now? I mean, if anything, it's empowered it even more than it ever has been?
The constitution that was drafted in late 2013 and passed indeed with a massive yes vote on a very low turnout shows how extremely fragmented Egypt is. And indeed, there is a sort of detailed clauses in there that are very much tailored towards protecting the interests of the military. And that is indeed exactly the problem with this constitution. In spite of its apparent broad support in society, that this is something that you could really call into question. Plus, indeed, I think it is correct to very much question the way the government that drafted the constitution was put in place. That was definitely not through democratic means, and that automatically undermines the legitimacy of such a constitution. The very fact, I think, that opposition was much less concerted than in the previous 2 years shows that the Egyptian people are wary, and I think they are craving stability, and they look at what they know best, and that was indeed a military who does certainly not subscribe to democracy, transparency, and that kind of governance. Can claim that they will bring stability back, and it shows almost the despair of the Egyptian people, and you know, a concern about the drop in living standards and things like that, that they basically put up with the situation and hope for better times.
Abdul Dadri, I mean, we've got another wave of protests underway. We're in the middle of it now. I mean, what is the aim here? Aren't Egyptians sick and tired of this sort of street action, which has put a halt to many lives?
This wave, the second revolutionary wave, is just the latest. Egyptians are not tired to seek their own freedom. Egyptians do not want more than their freedom, and there is no progress in the country unless freedom, social justice, and the rule of law are in place in Egypt. The economic is in bad situation now. There is no political process in Egypt. There is no social justice. We see the police state is coming back, and Egyptians will never accept the police state back in Egypt. They want to have their own democracy back. And I believe the Egyptians will continue in the streets. They've been there for almost 9 months now, peacefully, insisting on their peacefulness, and they will remain in the street. The free people of Egypt will remain in the streets. I assure you that until they dismantle the coup and bring democracy back. This is the only way for us to be able to live an honorable life. We've suffered a lot for more than 60 years living under dictatorship, and it is time for us to live as free people of Egypt.
So what are we seeing here, Adel Iskandar, an ongoing revolution?
I mean, it depends whose revolution. At the end of the day, what we see here is a game of musical chairs, whereby Mr. Dardiri speaks on behalf of the Egyptian people as though they're the Muslim, of course, failing to recognize that he's a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, but rather a larger swath of the Egyptian population, and that I think is deeply problematic. That every political group today speaks on behalf of the Egyptian people, including the military. That needs to be deconstructed in a very functional way. Nobody speaks on behalf of the Egyptian people. The Egyptian public is deeply fragmented, highly polarized, and there are different opinions. There are different perspectives. There are perspectives that are in favor of or in support of Mr. Dardiri's call for revolutionary action, and there are those who are deeply opposed to it. And it's hard to tell where the majoritarian perspective lies.
Carol, do you agree with that? Excuse me throwing that to Carol. Do you agree that nobody's really speaking on behalf of the Egyptian people?
Yes, I think that is a correct analysis. Egypt has become totally polarized because of the developments of the last 3 years. We have seen this oscillation between, the authoritarianism of the Mubarak years, then a party which came into power after 80 years itching to get its hands on governance, which is completely understandable, of course, but riding on this train of religious symbolism instead of coming up with concrete plans for economic development and indeed putting into effect social justice and things like that. And now again we are reverting back to a kind of militarized nationalism. I think these oscillations are not healthy. They reflect the uncertainties and the fragility and instability Egypt is now trying to cope with, and there must be a much wider range of opinions, but I think that is exactly the problem, that what drove the revolution in early 2011 was a vast scala of different opinions, which probably was only in agreement of what they did no longer want. But after that, it became very difficult to discern any unified agenda. And I think that is almost characteristic of these democratization processes, in particular in the transition phase, that there is a degree of chaos and uncertainty. And if people are impatient, if populations are impatient, then there is the tendency and almost the temptation for those who held power so far to step in again. And the only group within Egyptian society prepared to step in is the military, who is very well organized and has important interests to protect.
You talk about opinions, and here's another interesting opinion. The thoughts of veteran Egyptian politician Amr Moussa on the Muslim Brotherhood. Speaking earlier this month, the former foreign minister and head of the body that rewrote Egypt's constitution said, as long as they, the Muslim Brotherhood, are following the rules, playing by the same rule as we are playing, why should you exclude them? The road is open for them. If they so decide, the ball is in their court. How are you reading that, Abdul? I mean, is that an invitation for you to eventually get back into the political process? And if it is, how do you do that?
It is surprising who recognizes whom. Do the people recognize the government, or the government recognizes people? Because the same sentiment I heard also from the foreign minister. It is very surprising only happens in Egypt, that the government tries to recognize the people. I became a member of the Egyptian parliament because people voted me in. And I will be happy if people vote me out. I will try again and again. I only gain my legitimacy from the people of Egypt.
Yeah, but the lessons learned from this. I mean, do you think the Muslim Brotherhood should come forward and admit the mistakes that they were made?
the mistakes we committed are political mistakes, and we're willing to listen to what the people of Egypt say. It's not up to the military to decide who is democratic and who is not. It is the Egyptian people who make that final decision. And the negative polarization that we have now in Egypt is because of the military and because of the fascist media. It is not really because of the Muslim Brotherhood. During the Morsi, the first Morsi's year in government, we had positive polarization. We had the democratic process.
Adil, I mean, where do you think all of this leaves not only the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, we've got a mass trial of Muslim Brotherhood supporters underway in Egypt at the moment, but also any sort of opposition facing the military. That invite by Amr Moussa, what do you make of all of that?
I mean, it's obviously not a particularly serious invitation. You've got the vilification and demonization of the Muslim Brotherhood on one level, and then anybody else who might stand in opposition of the current government and its sort of its plan for its own democratization. So it's not a particularly serious invitation, but nevertheless, we also have the discourse coming out of the other side. You know, Mr. Dadiri sort of represents that, which doesn't lend much credence to any sort of strong opposition. I mean, again, speaking on behalf of the Egyptians at large, the assumption that the Muslim Brotherhood subsumes all political opinions that are oppositional to the government and not really building coalitions in a functional way. So that leaves, you know, Amr Moussa's narrative as the only real convincing one on the side. I mean, basically twisting the arm of the opposition and the Muslim Brotherhood and everybody else into conceding and playing by rules of the game that have been drafted by the military. But I think it's important for us to go back and kind of revisit this. I mean, Egypt has been a very, very bizarre roller coaster. Take, for instance, the example of the constitutional, the protection of the military, for instance, in these various constitutional periods. At some point, the military pushed for protections, or actually, let's just say, the military trials for civilians. That existed in the original draft of the Constitution that the Muslim Brotherhood supported and many of the revolutionary groups opposed. Then it appeared again in the Constitution that was pushed by Morsi and Mr. Dardiri's Muslim Brotherhood in the 2012 Constitution, and then now it reappears again, but this time with the game of musical chairs, the various political adversaries switching. So essentially, the military is being given a free ride by competing political forces, and nobody speaks on behalf of the Egyptian population at large, or has their interest in mind, or is prepared to challenge the military in their hegemony, and they do so only
let me
out
just
of
bring
opportunistic
Karul in here.
reasons.
I mean, we're waiting on a date for the presidential elections, and it seems that there's a lot of favour for Sisi.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there is at the moment no other individual which even, you know, can come close to Sisi in terms of having a hold on power and being able to profile himself as a sort of a unifying figure. The problem we have had in the last 3 years is that there has been actually no credible figure who has come forward which carries critical mass within society. Let's not forget that also Mohamed Morsi, if not second, was probably even third choice to step up on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood. He failed miserably. There was no clear agenda, so the disenchantment kicked in very quickly, and the military grabbed its opportunity, and very unexpectedly a general who until then had been relatively obscure in comparison to the top brass that had been around really for decades, saw his opportunity. But I think the whole situation we see, which Adil sketched indeed, is that there is this tremendous mistrust and suspicion on all sides of the intentions of the other side of the political spectrum. And that is not a healthy point of departure.
Let's leave it on that note. Thank you very much to my guests. Fascinating conversation. Adil Iskandar in Washington, D.C., Karul Kirsten in London, and Abdul Magood Dadri in Minneapolis. Now, before we go, let me just update you quickly on the 3 Al Jazeera journalists who have been held in a Cairo prison since December the 29th. Correspondent Peter Grester, along with producers Mohammed Fahmy and Baha Mohammed, are accused of having links with a terrorist organization and spreading false news. They'll next appear in court on Sunday. Abdullah Al-Shami from Al Jazeera's Arabic channel has been in custody for more than 6 months. Al Jazeera strongly rejects all the charges against its staff and continues to demand their immediate release. And you can keep up to date with Al Jazeera's extensive and continuing coverage of what is happening in Egypt on air and online at any time. I'm Jane Dutton. Thanks for watching. From me and all of the team, goodbye for now.